This is the Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Murphy.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Human Action Podcast. This episode, I want to go through a sort of 1-2 punch that the MMTers and some other related schools of thought will throw at the fiscal hawks. And so what they try to do is show both on theoretical and empirical grounds, referring specifically to U.S. history, that paying down the federal debt would be a disaster. And so they're going to try to argue that this will lead to economic calamity, and that, hey, this isn't even up for grabs. This isn't like an ideological theory. This is just basic accounting on the one hand. And then empirically, they're going to say, look at the record. Every time the U.S. government has significantly paid down the debt, there's been a depression. And so what are you guys doing? What are you thinking? It's not just look at the poor, beleaguered people who depend on federal funding, for their subsistence, but you're going to throw the economy into a huge crash. What are you thinking? All right. So let me first, to steelman the case, let me go ahead and just run through the standard MMT type presentation on both of these points. Okay, so as far as the theory is concerned, they often will appeal to what you might call sectoral balance equations. Michael Kalecki, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, I think he was the one that really drove home this point. I believe he's the one that Stephanie Kelton cites as the authority in her book, The Deficit Myth, for example. And he will go through it pretty straightforwardly, just take standard macro income accounting equations, just do simple algebra on them, rearrange terms and so forth, and end up with statements showing that if we set aside international trade, right, so we assume that the nation under consideration just has balanced trade with the rest of the world, then in order for the domestic private sector to engage in what you might call net saving, or to accumulate net financial assets, or sometimes they'll say to increase its net financial worth, the government necessarily needs to run a budget deficit for that period. And then going the other way, they'll say, if for some reason the government decides to run a budget surplus, right, so the government's paying down the outstanding government debt that period, well then necessarily, just again, in terms of pure accounting, they can show that that means there's going to be a reduction in the net financial assets held by the private sector. And Stephanie Kelton famously summarized this on Twitter. She showed a chart of the federal government's net surplus or deficit, and then overlaid that with the corresponding image for the private sector. And they were virtually mirror images with, anytime that the federal government was running a deficit, the private financial sector was running a surplus and vice versa. And then she summarized that by saying, their red ink is our black ink. Or I think no, more specifically, she said something like, their red ink makes our black ink possible. I think that's what the exact quote was. Okay, so that's like the theory. And again, they're saying this, we're not relying on Keynesian economics here. We're not talking about aggregate demand having a shortfall. We're not appealing to sticky prices or sticky wages or, the collapse in union bargaining power. They're not talking about any of that. They're not making specific assumptions about how the economy works. They're saying just writing out the simple equations summarizing income flowing to the various sectors over a period of time, out pops that result. Okay? And now, so that's, again, like the theory saying, so do you think it's a good idea to have the net financial assets held by the financials or the private sector going down? Do you think that might cause strain or stress to the private corporations and households financially to see their net assets shrinking? Okay. And then to say, let's look at the history books instead of just relying on pure theory. And I've seen different versions of this floating around, but here's one that I saw. I just did the screen capture from a YouTube video. Unfortunately, I'm not trying to throw the guy under the bus. I can't remember where I grabbed this from, but I was watching various YouTube rabbit holes as we are all wont to do at times in moments of personal weakness when you really should go to bed. And I saw this and I thought, wow, that's a great thing. And I grabbed it. And so here you can see he's citing this guy, Frederick Thayer, who compiled these statistics in 1996, and then apparently Kelton, recycled them and featured them in The Deficit Myth, okay, which came out in 2020. All right, so you can see here that, it'll show 6 major periods in U.S. history where there were prolonged and significant debt paydowns, right? So in other words, the U.S. federal government ran budget surpluses during these time periods in each of the years, and then it's showing from start to finish over this stretch how much did the outstanding total debt go down. And then it says, oh, and by the way, can we say anything about what the economy was like during these periods of significant and prolonged debt reduction? Oh, look at that. For every single time you see there was a major financial, they might have called it a panic back in the day, but what we would call depression with a small d, including, of course, the Great Depression, was preceded by the Roaring '20s when the Coolidge administration in particular ran a string of budget surpluses. They were trying to pay down the debt that had been accumulated during World War I. Okay? And look at that. So again, the MMTers would conclude, what more do you need to see that especially aggressive pay down of federal debt on both theoretical and empirical grounds is going to cause a huge economic crash? So why would anybody want to do that? And let me mention, it's not just the MMTers who say that. I've even seen Austrian adjacent fellow travelers who are saying, I understand we can't just keep running up the government debt forever, but let's not fool ourselves and let's be honest with the public when we're commenting on these things, that, at this point, if we were to reverse course and start paying down the government debt, we would cause a huge depression. All right. And they think, again, they agree with that analysis. Okay. So how do I, as an Austrian, respond to that? Okay. On the theoretical side, I'll just very briefly give my response here because I've done it extensively via, Mises Institute channels, including my book, Understanding Money Mechanics. So I'll link to that. There's a chapter in there. And then also, perhaps more specifically, I had a Mises.org daily article that ran years ago, and then they reran it once MMT got, had a resurgence in popularity. It was called The Upside Down World of MMT. So I'll link to it here, but if you want to try to find it yourself, you just can't wait, can't be bothered to go through the links. It's, again, it's Robert Murphy, The Upside Down World of MMT, and you should be able to find it that way. It ran at Mises.org if that helps you find it. And I just go through this. So let me just very briefly explain my points in those longer critiques. Insofar as it goes, like once you understand what they mean by the terms they're using, yes, the MMT accounting is correct, right? In other words, I'm not accusing them of an arithmetical or algebraic error. However, their presentation is extremely misleading, right? When Kelton says, referring to the government's budget deficit, their red ink makes our black ink possible, it leads you to believe that the private sector can't save or can't get ahead unless, or households can't pay down their debts unless there's an accounting mirror image and the federal government is running up its debt during the same accounting period. And that is not true. Okay? What it means when they say, for example, the private sector can't accumulate net financial assets, that word net is doing a lot of work there. So, for example, it could be the case that all the households in the private sector pay down their credit card debt in a given period. And you might say, oh, okay, so they're climbing out of debt. The households are paying down their debt. They're getting more financially secure and so forth. Okay, that's a good thing, right? And you could see statistics about like aggregate credit card debt in the U.S. going down or stuff like that. Household net worth going up. And the trick is they would say, oh, no, because if you as a household owe Visa $10,000 on your credit card bill and you pay it down to $8,000, well, yeah, your debt went down $2,000, but now Visa's assets went down $2,000, right? Because your debt to Visa on their books is an asset to them. And so taken as a whole, the total indebtedness of the private sector hasn't changed because you paid down your debt to Visa. And they would say, in fact, if we're looking at financial assets, right, and that's the thing, sometimes the MMT people are sloppy and they don't put the word financial in there. But to make the claim correct, they have to use that modifier financial to say financial net assets in the private sector. Again, if we exclude foreign trade, because foreigners could owe your private sector money. But if we just look at the domestic situation, or if we look at planet Earth as a whole, where there's no foreign sector vis-a-vis all of the Earthlings, which is the private sector as a whole, the net financial assets sum to zero the way the standard accounting is done. Okay, so if households have bonds issued by GE, those are net financial assets to the households, right? They have corporate bonds, but obviously those are liabilities to GE, and so it cancels out. And so the idea is a financial asset, by its very nature, is something that one party owes money to the other party. Now, maybe it's like a fixed income one, like it's a bond that pays out a different thing, or maybe it's an equity claim, like you own shares of corporate stock, where you don't know how many dollars is that going to translate to down the road, like if the company pays a dividend. But still, the idea is the way they tend to do the accounting on these things, the standard approach, the orthodox approach, is to say, the way you compute it, that net financial assets in a closed system sum to zero. Okay. And they do that because they want to avoid double counting. But I want to be clear, even on its own terms, that doesn't mean net assets always sum to zero. No, you can look at an economy that people can live below their means, they can save, they can accumulate, they can, instead of cranking out more cheeseburgers and sports cars and stuff like that, they can make factories and they can build more tractors and 18-wheelers and things that are not consumption goods or services, but are capital goods, and thereby increase the productivity of their labor over time. So their standard of living, or their real GDP, if you want to use that terminology, goes up over time, right? So there's nothing about these accounting identities that prevents a population of people, even if they don't have a government running budget deficits, from saving and investing and accumulating and increasing their capital stock over time and the productivity of their raw labor power, and having their standard of living increase and having their assets increase, right? That you start out in a little mud hut, and then over the generations, you'll end up living in huge mansions and, huge fields with, automatic irrigation and tractors that do all the heavy work and so forth, huge silos full of grain that you've accumulated over the years. That's all possible. You don't need government budget deficits to make that a possibility. Of course not. Okay? But again, the trick is you could have a bunch of genuine real assets, like huge factories, rooms full of supercomputers, mining bitcoins, satellites up in space doing telecommunications, do all sorts of stuff. And the corporations that owned those things as corporate assets would have those as real wealth, real assets. But then the idea is, if the households own shares of stock in those corporations that receive their market valuation implicitly via the net real assets held by the corporation, right? Like if the corporation issued some bonds, then the total market value of the corporation would have to take that into account, that it had those outstanding liabilities, right? But the idea would be, like, to a first approximation, the value of all the outstanding corporate shares of stock in that company would refer to its real assets, perhaps minus, the outstanding bonds. Okay. And so the point is, you wouldn't want to, when you add it up and said, what are the total assets held by the private sector in this type of example, you wouldn't want to count up all here's the factories, and here's the forklifts inside the factories, and here's all of the warehouses full of inventory that we're getting ready for the Christmas rush. So we're looking at all these coats and snowsuits and everything, and Christmas presents, all these toy train sets that we've been building up over the last few months and storing in these big warehouses. We're going to count all that up, and we got hundreds of billions of dollars of inventory, and that, those are real assets. That counts as part of the total wealth of this group of people in this particular private sector that we're analyzing, and if they happen to be held by corporations, yep, that's all part of the corporate assets. But then let's say that, that number is whatever, $5 trillion. And now the households own the shares of stock that ultimately, point to those corporations. You wouldn't then say, oh, the households own $5 trillion of corporate stock also, and so now there's $10 trillion in assets. That's the sense. No, you don't want to double count. The corporate shares held by the households have a mirror image in liabilities in a sense. They're not liabilities the same way a bond is to the corporation, so that those things net to zero, and then you're just left with the underlying real assets that we originally counted as being owned by the corporations. Okay, so that's how that stuff works. All right, now I kind of had to go through a little detour there to explain that, but once you see that context now, what Kelton is saying, again, relying on Kalecki and so forth, is that the only way the private sector can hold financial assets, right, claims that some other entity owes them a flow of dollars in the future, in the U.S. context, the only way that can be true on net is if there's some entity that's outside the private sector that owes them that flow of dollars. Oh, the government, that's the only entity that could do it. Right, if we're excluding foreigners, right? Foreigners could owe your people a flow of dollars, or the federal government could. But if sort of by definition you're drawing a shell around your domestic private sector and saying any dollars owed internally just sum to zero, and then you say, yeah, the only way some entity outside the private sector could owe the private sector money is if it's the government. Now I say, okay, so what? Because what's odd or ironic is the one entity owing the private sector money that should not be considered as wealth or financial assets in the same way that a household owning a corporate bond is a financial asset to that household would be the government, right? Because it's not that the government has to generate a profit through voluntary means and that it's buying inputs with its originally justly held property, converting them into goods and services that it sells to its customers voluntarily, and then earns a profit and then uses that to pay down the debt or to pay interest on the treasuries it's issued over the years. No, that's not how it works at all. The way the federal government services the debt held by the private sector is it either taxes them and says, oh yeah, we owe you some money. Here, we'll tax it from you at gunpoint and then give it right back to you. There you go. Aren't you so glad you're holding safe treasuries? Or they roll them over. They borrow from somebody else in the private sector to pay off the original lenders. Or they run the printing press, which, yes, that's a way to get a flow of dollars into the private sector. But is that really wealth in the same way that we're thinking of it when we say, oh, the household, has a checking account balance and it's got some bonds and it's got some corporate shares of stock that might pay dividends over time, where they could sell it if they needed to for the market price down the road. To say that those are all sources of dollars, is that wealth in the same way as if the federal government turning to the Fed says, just run the printing press? And certainly, for any individual household it might be, but in the aggregate, is the private sector made wealthier if the Federal Reserve just creates another $1 trillion and hands it over? No, of course not. The real wealth effects of that, you could either say are a wash, or I would actually say in general, in the long run, are negative. It's not just that, oh yeah, all prices adjust accordingly and everything's a wash. That no, I would say that causes the boom bust cycle and actually makes the private sector poorer in real terms in the long run. Okay, but for sure, to run around saying the only way the private sector can accumulate net financial assets is if the government runs up its debt, I think is incredibly misleading, and those terms don't mean in that context what they mean in the normal connotation when you think of a single household and it accumulating financial assets that are claims on other private sector entities. Okay, so that, like I say, is my response when it comes to the theoretical claims. But now let me tackle those empirical arguments to say, okay, sure, Murphy, you've got your perspective coming from an Austro-libertarian ideological view. We've got ours. Let's look at history, right? If it's really so good and wise for the federal government to pay down its debt and be responsible, just like a household is, then how come we see this correlation? Why is it that in U.S. history, whenever they do aggressive pay down of the debt, it leads to calamity, right? Okay, so let me pause for a moment and say, before I dive into the specifics here, let's step back and ask ourselves, in general, if you've got two people arguing and someone says this thing causes this other thing that we observe in history, what sorts of, and then they present and show an apparent correlation where it looks like, yeah, the thing that they're saying is the cause is followed by the thing they're saying is the result or the effect, and then the other person disagrees. What types of arguments or evidence could the critic bring up, just in general, right? So let's say the first person says, yeah, I think that rain dances cause severe rainstorms. And here, look at, I've got a list of 6 major examples from this tribe's history where the shamans did some serious rain dancing, like the most intense rain dancing we've ever really recorded. And in each of those instances, it was accompanied by massive downpours, some of the biggest downpours we've ever seen in this tribe's history. So there you go. Clearly, intense rain dancing causes intense rain showers. So now you're the critic of that. What would you say? Again, you can't just say, well, that's crazy, because the other person says, no, I don't think it is. Here's my theory, and they go through whatever the theory would be, and then here's my historical evidence. Okay, so I think the first thing you would do, if you were like genuinely trying to argue with the person or appeal to the public, is you'd say, all right, your theoretical mechanism doesn't make sense, and you would walk through. I'm not going to go through here and pretend I believe in rain dances, but whatever it is that they said, whether they're appealing to the gods or Mother Nature, whatever, you could go through and try to explain theoretically why, no, that doesn't work. I have a different theory as to what causes rain, and it does not involve rain dances, right? So that's one way in which you could try to attack that argument or that proposal or hypothesis. But then when you turn to the historical record, a great way to proceed, if the data is you would try to show, hey, are there any instances when the shamans really did intense rain dances and then there wasn't a big downpour? Right? To show, hey, sometimes the rain dances don't work. Right? So that would be one feather in your cap. And then could you do the flip side? Could you also point to examples where there were very intense rain showers that had not been preceded by intense rain dances? Right? And so then what you'd be able to show, like the fancy way they would say this in philosophy, is you would have thus, if the historical record allowed you to do that, honestly, then you could say, yep, we can see that rain dances are neither necessary nor sufficient for intense rain downpours, right? Because there's times where they do the rain dance, it doesn't rain heavily, and then there's also times when it's raining heavily and there's no preceding rain dance. Now notice too, just even I'm going through this silly example just to kind of warm us up and to figure how we're going to tackle the more serious question, you'd have to get precise, right? Like in principle, once somebody does a rain dance, are you going to say for the rest of time, anytime it rains, it's fair to say, oh, yep, see, the pattern holds because I can go back far enough in time and see that there was a rain dance. And so therefore, from that point forward, every single rain downpour that ever happens, we can attribute to that one time back in 1587 when they did rain. You see what I'm saying? That no, there has to be some time interval, like to say you do a rain dance, and likewise too. Suppose they do a rain dance and then nothing happens for a while. At what point do you get to say it didn't work? Right? Do you just keep waiting around, and as long as at some point it rains, then you can say, oh, yep, see, it works, just like we said. No, at some point, for this to be operational, to be falsifiable, to use that term, you'd have to have a time limit on it. So again, since I'm making this up and I don't believe in rain dances, and presumably most of you listening don't either, it's not worth getting into the specifics, but the person who's advancing this theory and gave their theoretical mechanism, you would have to ask them once you showed your thing. You could say, now come back, get a little more specific. With your theoretical mechanism, what time frame should we expect? And should it always be the same, right? Is it that if you do a rain dance, then boom, 16 hours later, the downpour should start? Or is it like, it could be anywhere, do rain dances have a long and variable lag for precipitation? Which is, I'm making a joke because that's what monetarists say, right? That there's no tight connection between changes in the money stock and then what happens with price inflation. Okay. And so monetarists famously say, yes, there's a long and variable lag, which I've joked in other contexts is like saying this actually isn't true. There's other causal factors at work. Okay. So there you go. All right. And so that's what I'm going to do here. Now, let me say, even having done what I'm going to do, and you folks can probably guess rhetorically, and the fact that I'm so proud of myself in this rain dance analogy, I'm going to go ahead and do that with paying down debt. I'm going to show that paying down the government's debt is neither necessary nor sufficient for an economic crash, right? Namely, I'm going to show there are times when the government's debt was paid down that was not followed anytime soon by an economic crash. And I'm also going to show there were economic crashes that were not preceded anytime in the recent past by significant government debt paydowns. So since I've tried to show you, and also that I could challenge the theoretical mechanisms, that's pretty easy. I don't think I need to do that here in the Human Action Podcast to say why I think the government paying down its debt, right, hold taxation constant, just have the government cut spending so it's running a surplus. That there's no intrinsic reason, given the way I think the world works, that the government cutting its spending such that it's paying down the debt year after year should all of a sudden cause the economy to crash. At the end of this episode, I will bring up a sophisticated element where, given the way our system works, there could be this third factor that kind of causes both. So I'll talk about that near the end. But I'm just saying, prima facie, in terms of economic laws and how do I think the world works, and how does the economy work and interact with government fiscal policy? No, in general, the government paying down debt should not cause an economic crash. Okay. And so, and I'm going to show you the historical records like that too. But let me say that admittedly, and in fairness to the MMTers, is not a mic drop, right? Because you could also imagine a more nuanced scenario, like something like smoking, right? The opponent of cigarette smoking could say, hey, smoking causes cancer, lung cancer, right? And then the defender of big tobacco could say truthfully, no, what are you talking about? Look I can show you all kinds of case studies of people who got lung cancer, even though they never smoked a single cigarette. And I can show you examples of people who smoked a pack a day and never got lung cancer. And in some cases, it's not just because they died in a car crash when they were 38, but no, they lived into their 70s, never got lung cancer. So smoking is neither necessary nor sufficient for lung cancer. QED, smoking has nothing, you see, and that last step would be the wrong one, presumably, based on my knowledge of the evidence and so forth, right? But even there, you would have to amend the claim. It's not that smoking causes lung cancer, period, the way mass causes gravitational attraction. It would be more like smoking is a strong contributor to lung cancer, or smoking makes it much more likely that you will develop lung cancer in the long run, or some, you see what I'm saying? Okay. So again, maybe after I go through this demonstration, the honest MMTers out there would come back and say, okay, yes, some of the people on our side on social media might make hyperbolic claims. Really what it should be is that aggressive paying down of government debt enhances the instability in the private sector, a la Minsky. And so it's not that it guarantees there's going to be a crash. It just means year by year, the probability of a crash is higher than another. They could say something like that. All right. And then, I would come through and we could go back and forth. Okay. Because with smoking, yes, you can find counterexamples, but presumably with a big enough pool, you would find that the probability that somebody gets lung cancer, if you're doing regression analysis or something, it looks like there's statistical significance on their smoking habits in terms of predicting whether that person's going to have lung cancer down the road. Okay. So, having gone through all that and giving you the framework, let me now just run through the empirical bit. So for one thing, I would point you to, I'll put a link in the show notes page, of course. I wrote an article for Econ Library, a while ago, talking about the economic literature and the case for so-called fiscal austerity. And what I pointed out is, and I give examples, I document all this stuff, just showing how like Paul Krugman and Christina Romer at the time, this was back during the Obama years, during the rounds of QE. And then when, that didn't work, right? The economies of the world in the wake of the financial crisis of 2008, so-called Great Recession, they were still mired in the doldrums, even though they had run massive government budget deficits and that their central banks had slashed interest rates to basically zero and done massive accumulations of fixed income assets, like government bonds and in the U.S. case, mortgage-backed securities. Didn't seem like it was working. And so then some of them said, all right, we got to get our fiscal house in order. We just can't keep running these huge deficits. We got to start tightening our belts. And so Krugman and Christina Romer, among others, came in telling everybody, what are you doing? This is Herbert Hoover 2.0 if you do that. And they're acting like it was just an insane theory, this notion that somehow paying down government debt might help your economy. And they were saying, no, it doesn't. That's crazy. There's no evidence of that. There's no theoretical right, okay. So I was just going through and showing they're completely full of it. And ironically, one of the key pieces in the literature showing the strong effect that government tax policy has on economic growth came from Christina Romer, along with her male Romer co-author. So it was really weird in her case. Okay, but in any event, Krugman as well, in a different context, had also argued that Keynesian deficit spending arguably has one example in history where it worked, right? Krugman from the late 90s, that is, said that. Okay, so my point was, don't listen to them. They're bluffing. That there's plenty of stuff in the economic literature backing up this idea that when governments get into fiscal trouble, they need to cut spending and that will not crash the economy. Okay, so here I'm quoting from believe it or not, the European Central Bank. And this might have been motivated by political reasons. It might have been that some major Euro countries like Germany, wanted to encourage austerity. And so the people at the ECB knew, like, yep, this is what the big boys want, so we're going to go ahead and do this. But in any event, this was what they published. The ECB had a bulletin that came out in June 2010 explaining or assessing the record of fiscal consolidation, okay, in Euro-era countries. And this is what they said. The empirical literature offers diverse results as to whether fiscal consolidations in the Euro area have had expansionary effects on economic activity in the short run. With reference to the periods of sizable government debt reductions mentioned above, expansionary fiscal consolidations are suggested in Ireland, the Netherlands, and Finland. Looking at a broader range of experiences, it is found that around half of the fiscal consolidations in the EU in the last 30 years have been followed by an improved output growth performance in the short term relative to the initial starting position. Okay, so what they're saying is they specifically highlighted Ireland, the Netherlands, and Finland as case studies of here's examples where they did aggressive debt reduction and their economies were fine. All right, so showing it could be done. And then they're also saying we broadened our results and looked at over the last 30 years, in around half the cases it worked and the other half it didn't. And you might say, oh, so it's just a coin flip? Well, no, I don't have it quoted here, but they got more specific and said to try to understand how come sometimes it works and sometimes so-called fiscal consolidation does lead to a bad economy, seeming to justify the Keynesians' worry. And they said, oh, it's because in those cases where the economy crashed, it's because these governments tried to pay down their debt by raising taxes. in contrast, if we look at the cases where the countries largely dealt with their debt problem by cutting spending and not increasing taxes significantly, then they got their debt under control and didn't crash the economy, right? So that's what they said, just looking empirically to try to understand how come sometimes it seems to work and sometimes it doesn't. And so now I'm saying, as an Austro-libertarian, is that surprising to anybody? That if the government's been running up a big debt and people are like, geez, this can't continue, we need to start running surpluses to start whittling away at that problem. And the way you go from having a huge government deficit, to a government surplus, do you think it matters from an Austrian perspective whether you do that flip by jacking up taxes versus cutting spending at the government level? Of course, cutting spending is the way to do it. That would release resources back to the private sector, whereas increasing taxes takes more from the private sector. So it's not, no Austrian would deny jacking up taxes will crash the economy. No kidding. Okay, so that's not hurting us any. What it is hurting is the Keynesian story. The Keynesians are saying, no, you need government deficit spending to be an extra component in aggregate demand. And if the economy is already on the ropes, the last thing in the world you want to do is suddenly slash government spending. That's what caused the Great Depression, they'll say. Okay, so I'm saying there's all these counterexamples that the ECB highlighted in its bulletin of countries that got into debt trouble, solved that problem by aggressive cuts in government spending, and their economies were fine. Okay, so that's totally consistent with the Austrian worldview, totally at odds with the Keynesian. Okay, let me now give a little more evidence on the specific case of Canada. And I know this case well because back in 2012, I, along with two Canadian co-authors for a Canadian think tank, we did like a little briefing, or white paper's too grandiose a term, but it was like a little scenario analysis of this particular episode in Canadian history. And David Henderson also, if you know him, he also in 2010 had done a similar piece for a different outfit. All right, so here's the story. So I'm reading here from my Econ Lib article explaining what happened. By the mid-1990s, the Canadian federal government had been running deficits for 2 decades, with 1/3 of federal revenue being absorbed by interest payments. Again, 1/3 of their government's tax receipts were being dedicated to just paying interest on their debt. That's how deep in the hole they were. A Wall Street Journal editorial on January 12th, 1995 declared that Canada, quote, has now become an honorary member of the third world in the unmanageability of its debt problem. Okay, so that's what the Wall Street Journal said about Canada as of early 1995. Right, so this was serious. So this is me now telling the story. Yet the Canadians swiftly solved the crisis with serious reforms. In just 2 years, from 95 to 97, total federal government spending fell by more than 7%. All right, so that's in absolute terms. Normally, when you talk about cutting government spending, you mean cutting relative to what the baseline was, right? Like, so in other words, spending originally was going to go up 3% and it only went up 2%. So that's like a 33% cut. No, that's not what we're talking about. They're saying the absolute level of Canadian dollars that the Canadian government spent in 95 to 97 went down 7%. They literally cut spending over those 2 years. While the budget deficit that started out at $32 billion, which was 4% of GDP, that changed to a $2.5 billion surplus. Okay, so they went from having a deficit that was 4% of their economy, and then in 2 years it switched to a modest surplus because, again, cutting spending. Now, there were also tax increases, but the ratio of spending cuts to tax increases was about 5-1. Okay, so it was very heavily in terms of that fiscal turnaround, going from a big deficit to a modest surplus. That was the lion's share of that. It was achieved by actual cuts in government spending rather than raising taxes. Canada's federal government then went on to run 11 consecutive budget surpluses, right? So from 11 years forward, they actually had a slight surplus. And what did that do? It caused the overall debt to GDP ratio to go from 78% in 96 down to 39% in 2007. Okay? again, their debt to GDP ratio in 96 was at 78%, and then 11 consecutive budget surpluses, it gets whittled down to 39%. All right, so that, can we all agree, that is an aggressive fiscal austerity program. Largely through tax cuts, they go from having a big size deficit to a modest surplus. They run a surplus for 11 years in a row, paying down the debt while their economy continues to grow, such that the overall debt to GDP ratio plummets from 78% to 39%, basically getting cut in half. Okay? And so then you say, oh, what happened? Did Canada get plunged into a major depression? No, this last one I'll read on this case. In the decade after reform, Canada outperformed all the other G7 nations on economic growth, investment, and job creation. According to IMF data, from 96 to 2005, Canada's average growth of real GDP was 3.3%, with the U.S. the runner-up with 3.2% growth, and the G7, excluding Canada, averaging only 2.1% growth. And even in the short term, Canada's dramatic spending cuts and modest tax increases in the mid-1990s had only mild side effects, causing only a temporary uptick in the unemployment rate. Okay, so there you go. Now, I want to just mention, so people don't accuse me of dishonesty, back when the ECB bulletin came out, and guys like me were pointing to it and running victory laps and saying, what are you guys talking about, you Keynesians? There's plenty of examples of history of fiscal austerity working. And the times when it didn't work, it's because they raised taxes. Like, so, libertarianism for the win. And Krugman went through and he tried to explain away each of those case studies of where it ostensibly worked. And so for Canada, what people will say is, oh, well, the reason Canada didn't plunge into depression is that their currency weakened, and so they just had a bunch of net export increases. And so that they exported their way out of that. Otherwise, yes, they would have plunged into depression. So very quickly, I want to say, yes, that is what happened. But again, that's not like some weird escape hatch that a classical free marketeer would be baffled by. Just in general, when the government cuts spending, right, and the government's debt, at least in terms of relative share of the economy, goes down and its interest payments go down, right? The government is shifting away from consuming resources, right? And it's, the government's footprint in the economy is shrinking. So what's that going to do? That's going to increase the private sector's footprint. Or put it this way, if the government demand for goods and services from the private sector goes down, as a free marketeer, what do you think is going to happen? Permanent unemployment? No, you're going to see that's going to be replaced by selling to private sector buyers, right? And so, in general, would you expect that just to happen, just to cater to your own domestic population? No. If the Canadian government stops buying so much from the private sector, Canadian producers, right, then the Canadian producers are going to sell to entities besides the Canadian government to make up for it. Otherwise, they would have to lay people off, right? So who are they going to sell to? They can sell to other Canadians in the private sector, or they can sell to foreigners, right? So, of course, other things equal, yeah, you would expect if one country in isolation, if its government slashes spending, you would expect that government's or that nation's private sector to have more sales to its private sector domestically and increase exports. Why wouldn't you expect to see that? And then when you say in terms of the mechanics, how does that actually manifest itself? Like how do the people in the system know they need to export more? You want to talk like that? Well, the mechanism is that interest rates on Canadian government debt would go down, right? Because now they're paying down their debt and they're not spending as much. And so that makes people around the world not want to hold as much Canadian debt. And so they don't need to, so net capital flowing into Canada goes down. And so then that means, right, foreigners, when they were accumulating Canadian government debt, they were having to sell imports into Canada to pay for it. And so now that that's slowed down or stopped, that means Canadian exports can increase, right? So that's one way of seeing the mechanism, okay? So there you go. All right. Now let's look at the U.S. example. One thing that, of course, that table left off was the 2008 crisis, right, called the Great Recession. Most people think of that as the second worst economic calamity to hit the U.S. after the Great Depression. And that was not at all followed by a reduction in government debt. In fact, in here, I'm just looking at the overall level of the total federal debt that the Treasury puts out. Yeah, if we look from, for example, 2002 through 2007, just to get like a 5 or 6 year jump, total federal public debt went up 44.6%. And then you had the Great Recession. All right. So when you contrast that with, if we put that chart up again, you can see they said, from 1817 to 1821, over that 4-year period or 5-year period, however you want to clock that, the debt went down, and it caused a depression, right? So they're looking at, 4-year, 5-year periods, and they'll say, okay, well then, is that true that in the 5-year period before the Great Recession, that there was a significant pay down in debt? No, the exact opposite. Okay, so there again, we see in terms of the rain dance analogy, right, that, we can have a massive downpour that was not preceded by a rain dance. Okay, so here we can have a global financial crisis that certainly was not preceded by all the governments of the world aggressively paying down their debt. It's not at all what happened. Okay, so clearly there's more to the story, that government debt pay down is not necessary to get an economic crash. Okay, and now you can say, is it sufficient? And so that's what I was getting to, like with the Canadian examples and the other ones. I'm showing in general, it's not sufficient, right? Meaning you can have aggressive government debt pay downs that are not followed by a crash. That's what I was doing there when I focused on the Canadian example, just to relay it to the rain dance thing, right? So I'm showing you in general, there's plenty of examples from history of governments aggressively paying down their debt without there being an economic crash anytime soon. Okay, so yes, I have done that in general, but now for the U.S., there's a little bit of trickiness going on here. Okay, so one thing is, in terms of these 6 periods that Kelton shows in her book, and again, I've seen this elsewhere too. It's not that Kelton's the only one, and admittedly, she's reproducing it from this guy Frederick Thayer. And there's also, I think who this guy is, because I've also, if you just go and look at it, I found a different website that says Frederick C. Thayer, a professor of public administration at George Washington University, wrote an article titled "Do Balanced Budgets Cause Depression?" for the Washington Spectator on January 1st, 1996, and then it goes through and lists the stuff. So that's that's exactly what Kelton is citing too. All right, so I guess this stuff does go back to this guy Frederick Thayer. Okay, so my point is that there's actually a period of aggressive government pay down of debt that occurs earlier than this first example he cites. And so you might be tempted to say, aha. So specifically, just I'm talking about, it is, again, using the official data from the Treasury in terms of the outstanding historical federal debt. And these are fiscal years, right? So this doesn't quite line up with calendar years. They're off by one. The data set I'm looking at here from the Treasury's fiscal years. But from fiscal 1803 through 1811, the total federal debt was paid down 47.7%. Right, and it was every single one of those years in between, they ran a surplus. Okay, so you can say, aha, see? Unfortunately, be careful, and I did check, to say, was there a problem there? Well, yeah, there was what was called a depression in the middle of that. But admittedly, it's tricky because there was the Embargo Act of 1807, right? So if you go and look and see, was there an economic problem in the U.S. in this period? They will say, yes, there was. But most people agree the U.S. put on this huge embargo. And so, of course, that's going to destroy international trade. All right. So it's hard to disentangle that. So I'm not claiming a victory lap because they could say, see, that's our pattern. But I'm saying we'll put that aside. Just like I wouldn't claim COVID, right? Technically, you could say unemployment went way up under COVID, and hey, that wasn't followed by a huge government debt pay down. But I'm not going to cite that against the MMTers because, that's kind of a wild card for that one. Okay. But I'm saying likewise for here, I'm going to say I don't think they can necessarily claim that in their favor, but likewise, we can't claim it in our favor. Okay. What I will say, though, is what's interesting about these and why when I said with the rain dance example, surely to operationalize that, you're going to have to put some constraints. You can't just say, oh, these guys have been doing a rain dance like crazy, and then eventually, 12 years later, there was a downpour. So clearly, right? Like, in other words, what would it look like if you were wrong? Wouldn't it look like they're doing a rain dance over and over and over and over? There's no downpour. And so I'm saying, just look here. We'll pull up the chart that was based on. And by the way, I just noticed that there's a typo here. The depression's there in the top right. That's a typo. But notice they've got, according to their numbers here, from 1823 to 1836, the debt was fully paid off. Right? And notice too, they say in the, underneath there in the, with the asterisk, the debt was actually paid off in 1835 and the U.S. was in a surplus by 1836. Okay. So that is, according to their numbers there, that's a good 13 years of straight surpluses. And then the Depression begins in 1837. So I want to say, if it's the case that aggressive government debt pay down causes a depression, isn't that interesting that it took 13 years for it to happen there? Does everyone get my point? In other words, like, what would have happened if they had stopped doing that, in 1828, and they had only paid down, 20% of the federal debt? Are they saying, then there would have been a crash in 1829? Or would there still have been a crash in 1837 and that would have, you folks get what I'm saying? Or a different way of looking at it is look at the difference between that first row and the second row. In the first row, they're showing 2 years of government debt pay down, which couldn't have been all that much, right? Because the total over the 5-year stretch was 29%. And since I have the numbers, I can tell you, in 1817 and 1818, the first year, like I'm showing it as fiscal 1816, there was a 3% reduction. And then in 1817, there was a 16.2%. So in absolute terms, the federal debt went from 127 million down to 103 million over those 3 years, right? And that apparently was enough to cause the first major depression in the U.S., the Depression of the Panic of 1819. Right? That modest thing. So if that's the case, why is it that from 1823, why did they get all the way to 1836 and manage to completely pay off the debt? And then they had another year where they had extra money that they had to figure out what are we going to do with this because we've already paid off the debt. And then the Depression didn't start till 1837. You see what I'm saying? So clearly, even on this table's own terms, the connection between paying down debt and a subsequent depression is tenuous. And again, I would say the same thing likewise if you jump down to the second last one in this table, the 1880 through 93. Again, if that first row, we're going to say, just 2 years of that debt pay down, which was accumulated from the War of 1812. If just the first 2 years, that was enough to plunge us into the Depression of 1819, well, then how come in the stretch where they're saying, from 1880 to 1893, look what happened. Why did it take 13 years? Okay. And And then likewise too with that last one. So and here's something too, let me mention, with a bunch of these examples where they're running surpluses after a war for for a decade plus, right? Like that's what's going on in the 1920s, of course. It's right after World War I. The U.S. had a huge debt that it carried over, and they were trying to pay it down over time. Because what's going on here, folks, before the rise of Keynesianism, in the 30s, of course, is when that came to the forefront. Before that, people looked at governments as if they were giant corporations fiscally. And so you could run up a big debt if there's a crisis, particularly a big war you got to fight. But then the responsible thing to do over time is to pay it down, just like a household or a corporation. If there's a crisis, you can go into debt, but then you pay it down. So that's what they were doing here. And so I'm saying with some of these examples where, there was a war, huge debt run up, and then they were paying it down over time. And if you can show, they could go a full decade paying that down. And then it stops because there's a crisis. Well, again, that doesn't show that the paying down of the debt caused the crisis. Really, the simplest explanation of that is, when there's a war, you run up the debt, then you're running surpluses and paying it down. And then if there's an economic crash, you're probably going to stop running surpluses at that point because you just had the economy crash. But it's the fact that in some of these cases it took more than a decade kind of makes it strained to say, the reason that crash happened a decade later was because of all these pay downs of the debt. Okay, and then the last thing I'll just say here in conclusion is there is a sense in which I can understand why there could be a correlation because there's some third factor causing this up. Specifically, if the central bank, in conjunction with the private banks, fuels an unsustainable boom, then that could cause, the economy to rise. That could cause other things equal. Tax revenues increase. People don't need as much government assistance. And so government spending as a share of the economy might fall. And so you could see how an unsustainable boom in the Austrian framework could, other things equal, make the economy tilt towards budget surpluses, right? Like I think that's what happened in the 1990s, right? With the dot-com bubble under the Clinton administration, there was a few years of a fiscal surplus, right? And then there was the 2001 crash. So the way I would explain that, it's not that Clinton modestly paying down the debt caused the economy to crash. I would say, no, it was the dot-com bubble fueled by the Fed and its loose money policies that allowed revenue to soar under Clinton such that he had some modest surpluses, but then the economy crashed, not because of the surpluses, but because of the unsustainable boom. Okay, so I do think there is that mechanism at work, and that's why, yes, you might see in general that it's not just a pure crapshoot, that, it does seem like there are long periods of paying down government debt followed by a sharp crash. But again, I would say the causality is not that government debt reduction means a bad economy eventually. I think it's that the ostensibly strong economy that allows for the pay down of debt is often caused by central bank hanky-panky, right? And so with all this stuff, if you had a solid monetary and banking system, then that would no longer play a role. And then I think you really would see, government pay down of debt is consistent with a healthy economy, and there's no reason statistically that makes you more likely to experience a crash. Okay, well, I'll wrap it up there. Thanks for your attention, everybody. The takeaway message: paying down government debt is good for the economy in terms of promoting stability in private sector standards of living, both in theory and, I would argue, in practice. See you next time.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. In the meantime, you can find more content like this on Mises.org.